Morning, everyone. All right, we are back in the book of Ecclesiastes today, and we're going to look at the first part of chapter 7. So if you want to start turning with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Not going to spend a lot of time doing a recap because most of what we're going to talk about here is self-contained, and also as we go through it, we'll tie back to some of the things that Solomon has said previously. So we can just jump right in here starting with verse 1. Solomon says, "A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth." So we've got two comparisons here, and they're connected together with the word "and." So we'll take apart each of them and then talk about why Solomon's putting them together the way he is. The first one's pretty easy. A good name is better than fine perfume. Good name, we all know this. He's talking about integrity. He's talking about our reputation. And when he says fine perfume, if you're reading along in another translation, you might have ointment or something like this. Here we got to bridge the gap of culture a little bit. He's talking about indulging in pleasure, indulging in some expensive indulgence like that. And so his point is having integrity, being a person of good reputation is better than experiencing expensive pleasures, that sort of thing. Very straightforward. The second one requires a little more thought when he says the day of death is better than the day of birth. And this is one that maybe on our own, without really spending some time thinking it through, I don't know this would come out of our mouths right away. But later on, he's going to make the point again, albeit a little bit differently, when he's going to say that the end of something is more significant than the beginning. And this is what he's getting at here. We'll talk about it here, and we'll talk about it when we get to that part as well. The day of death is greater than the day of birth. The end of something is more significant than the beginning. Again, not coming naturally to us necessarily, but think through some of the significant things in life. High school. I imagine your first day of high school, if you've gone through that, and most of us have. Some of us, it was a long, long time ago, but I do remember it was an exciting thing. Right? I got to meet again with some friends I hadn't seen in months. The summer was over. It was exciting to be in a new situation like that, and then high school was a big deal, so it was exciting that first day of school, but what about the last day, graduation? Much, much more significant, right? Tremendously more important, tremendously better the last day of high school than the first. It's the same with relationships. Think about a marriage, right? People get together, they fall in love, they decide to get married, and people will come from all over, friends and family will come from all over to celebrate the beginning of this thing. It's an amazing thing. It's a tremendous thing. But let me tell you, what's even more amazing than that is conducting a funeral for a man at a previous church and his wife of like 55 years or so sitting in the front row and looking at her and thinking, what have they all been through? They suffered together. They suffered and they persevered together. They developed character together, and they suffered and they persevered and developed more character, and they earned faith in God through this. It was a tremendous testimony of sacrifice and service to God, tremendously more significant that day than the day that they were married. So we have these two comparisons, right? The good name being more important or better than pleasure, and a day of death being better than the day of birth. And he connects these together with that word "and." So one comparison here follows the other. And so what Solomon is saying here very simply is finish well. He's saying don't live foolishly. As you're going through your life, remember your good name, your integrity, your reputation is more important than indulging in luxuries and pleasure. And add a whole lifetime of that together, and the day of your death is far better and more significant than the day of your birth. When you're born, people rejoice. You got a whole life ahead of you, and I hope it's a good one. But if you know Christ as your Savior, the day you die, this earthly life is over, but you have gone on to an eternity with your Savior, and it is a far better place than this one. This brings us to our Romans 8:28 moments that we keep talking about here. Solomon is saying, finish well, and pleasure is pleasurable, right? We like that. It's an enjoyable thing, but he's saying integrity is more important than pleasure. And the truth of the matter is, in this life, sometimes we have to trade one of these things for the other. And that's what brings us to our Romans 8:28 moments. We keep coming back to, right? Paul promises us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. That's that rock solid promise from God that if you are his child, if you've put your faith in Christ, God has ordered things in your life so that whatever it is you're going through, it's for your good, even if that feels bad. Right? Sometimes we go through these Romans 8:28 moments where God trades some of our pleasures to grow us to become better people who have more integrity and can serve him better. That's verse 1. He continues, verses 2 through 4. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. Back when I was studying to go into the ministry, a little over 10 years ago, my pastor had said that this passage was one that he read at every funeral that he has ever done, and told me why. And I took that to heart, and for whatever reason, in 10 years I've been in the ministry, God has allowed me to, or had me present at a lot of funerals. I started out in a nursing home, so it was like one funeral after another. But I'd taken that man's advice in every single funeral I've ever presided over. We have read this passage. It's very, very important. Very important to understand what Solomon is telling us here. Solomon's not saying that feasting and laughter are bad. Right? He's not saying there's no place for that in your life. Because remember, last week, he'd said that stuff, feasting and laughter, those joyful moments in life, last week Solomon said that is a gift from God along with the gift from him to enjoy those things. That's part of the inheritance that we get as God's children. There's a season for that stuff. There's a season for feasting and laughter. But remember also one of the points that we talked about last week, these are two different blessings from God. God is the one who gives wealth to people, but God is also the one who gives the ability to enjoy that wealth. And the point that Solomon was making last week is those are two different gifts, right? The first one, the God giving out wealth to people, God gives out wealth to believer and unbeliever alike. You don't have to follow God for him to allow you to be successful in your career and make a lot of money. But the second gift, the ability to ultimately enjoy that stuff, that's reserved for his own. We said last week, there's nothing cruel about that. If God just reserved wealth for those who followed him, everybody would follow him for the wrong reasons. So he allows anybody to be able to be successful and accumulate wealth, even though that comes from him. But he withholds the ability to ultimately enjoy those things. He withholds that from all but those who are his children for a very practical reason. If he let those who didn't follow him accumulate wealth and find meaning and purpose and ultimate joy in the accumulation, they would never realize they need to turn to God, and they would miss salvation and spend an eternity of suffering. So God withholds that mercifully for that very reason, to get people's attention. And so life under the sun, life without God, is exactly what Solomon says it is. Toil, labor, and misery. And so people in the middle of all of that, life under the sun, life without God, a life of toil, misery, and labor, people, rather than turning to God, tend to medicate themselves with drugs or materialism or something else. Go back to verse 1. People buy and use fine perfume, and that helps numb the pain for a short period of time, but then the numbness wears off, the pain returns, and so people search for more pleasure, and the cycle repeats, and it repeats, and it repeats. And so what Solomon is really telling us here in verses 2 through 4, all that cycle of trying to numb the pain in life under the sun, he says it's better for you to go to a funeral than to a feast and do more of that. Reason is, very simply, we know people chase after pleasure to keep from having to acknowledge their spiritual needs. When you're in a house of mourning, when you go to a funeral, all this stuff comes into perspective if you're wise. Right? Tend to sit back and reflect on things and realize, I'm not going to be around forever. There's an ultimate purpose to all of this. My time is limited. I have some decisions to make. If you're wise, you notice those things. Solomon says that sorrow because of this is better than laughter. Listen, laughter distracts us while our sorrow teaches us. This is very, very important. The mind of the fool is always focused on the party. The mind of the fool, Solomon says, is always focused on that TV show that they're wrapped up in watching. And the mind of a fool thinks their lives should be painless. Let me tell you, the church is full of fools who think this way too. Church is full of pastors who teach these things. I don't want to go too far down a rabbit trail, but we've all seen on the internet and on TV plenty of church scenes where you got a pastor standing up and saying, hey, give your money to the church and it'll come back tenfold right back to you. Or, if you're sick or dying or whatever, just come up here and let one of us touch you and then all these problems are going to go away, right? They offer these solutions to all the trials in our lives. Just come up here and we'll lay hands on you and it'll be done. Put some extra money in the plate. Your trials will go away. That's not true. That idea completely contradicts the entire book of Ecclesiastes, doesn't it? We've been in this book for weeks now, and the whole premise here, Solomon is saying, if you don't have God in your life is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The only thing for you is misery and toil. But if you do turn to God, there's going to be meaning, there's going to be joy, but there's still going to be pain, there's still going to be trials, and most of this book is how do we process and how do we deal with that. So this idea of the prosperity gospel and faith healing and all of this completely contradicts Ecclesiastes. It contradicts Romans 8:28, right? If God has promised you that whatever season in your life you're in for your good, even if it doesn't feel good, the idea that you can just get up and, come up here, I can touch you, everything goes away, it contradicts the whole point of God having these plans for us. It contradicts the book of James, the Romans 5 maturity model, all the things we have been talking about for years here, and on and on. God has given us all of the seasons of our lives for a reason, and that includes going to a house of mourning. Don't miss the point of that in your life. When God has you in the house of mourning, you're there for a reason. Learn from it so your suffering can be worthwhile. Verse 5, it is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. More of the same. Listen. Any of us could miss a couple of feasts, right? We could skip a couple of the parties and your life will go on. It really won't make any difference at all. But fail to heed the rebuke of a wise person in your life, that leads us to trouble. It is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Verse 6, like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Sure you guys all know, go have a campfire, whatever, you find some thorns, throw that into the fire, and what happens? They burn very quickly. They light up, and lots of crackling sounds, and it burns really fast, and it's hot, and then there's nothing left. It's gone very, very quickly. And Solomon says this is the same way with the laughter of fools. It crackles very loud, but it doesn't last. And our lives will be just fine if we never hear the crackling of a fool's laughter again. But if we fail to go to a house of mourning, or if we fail to heed the rebuke of a wise person, we will be in trouble indeed. Verses 7 through 10, extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. So Solomon starts out in verse 10 telling us this very plain truth that I think we all know. With wisdom and prosperity come temptations that you would not have if you didn't have this wisdom and prosperity. And those temptations can cause us to give up that wise lifestyle and start living like a fool. This is why I'm sure most of you guys have heard the statistics about, it's like a staggering percentage of people who win the lottery go bankrupt after just a few years. Right? Because they started out without a bunch of money, then they have a bunch of money, don't have the wisdom to deal with it, and it becomes problematic. And so verse 7, this can be both meaningless and critically important at the very same time. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Solomon has spent page after page telling us that all of this is meaningless. Yes, there is corruption, and yes, extortion can turn a wise person into a fool, but Solomon has been saying in the long run, we're all dead anyway, and whether this person acted like a fool or acted wisely doesn't really matter, because they're going to be just as dead at the end of their lives either way. From a worldly perspective, this too is meaningless, but from a godly perspective, this verse is very, very important. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Because while worldly speaking, that doesn't matter, Solomon has been telling us God is going to judge. There is going to be justice. There is going to be an accounting for everything that is done under the sun. Verses 8 through 10, again, he comes back to this idea that the end of a matter is better than its beginning. Right? And he says, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. And then verse 10, again, do not say, why were these old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. So Solomon here is bringing this up because he knows when we are going through life's Romans 8:28 moments, when we're going through trials that God has put in our lives for our good, Solomon knows that all of us can be tempted in the face of that to start living like a fool. Verse 8, he talks about pride making the person become impatient. Verse 9, he talks about the person being provoked to anger. And verse 10, he talks about the person living through this Romans 8:28 moment, God helping them, growing them, doing something for their good, but we have the person complaining about being in that time and kind of longing for the good old days when God wasn't doing this good thing in their lives. Also, again, the way it started, verse 8, the end of the matter is better than the beginning of it. We talked about this at the very beginning. It's worth bringing up again here because Solomon brings it up again, so we'll talk about it a second time. We talked about the end of your life is better than the day of your birth. And it's the same concept here about the end of a matter is better than its beginning. It's all a matter of perspective, right? It's all everything we've been working through for so long is all comes down to a perspective, looking at things through a godly lens rather than a worldly lens. In our flesh, what comes naturally to you and me, we prefer the laughter and the fun times, don't we? Right? That's what we want. That's where we always want to be. We want to avoid the pain, the discomfort, and the loss. And so Solomon tells us here, he reminds us of what is truly valuable. He tells us the end of a matter is better than the beginning of it. I was trying to think of a good example of this, and my mind kind of wandered to something a long, long time ago when I was a kid, back in junior high school age, I think it was. I did a couple of really long bike rides for charity, and they were 150 miles each. And each ride spanned the course of a couple of days. And it was to help raise money for multiple sclerosis, or to fight multiple sclerosis, which is something my mom had. So it was special to me. And so in those days of leading up to the ride, you'd train and you'd raise money for the event. And so you spend a lot of time doing this, a lot of time thinking about the event, and then you show up on a Saturday morning, and there were a lot of riders there. It was a very popular event, and everybody was kind of joking and laughing and carrying on, and it was fun, right? The beginning of this was a good time. And then the ride starts. And it started off pretty easy, and everybody's going fast, and there's still some joking, amongst the riders as we're riding, and then the day goes on, and the day starts to get harder and harder. And then after riding 75 miles that day, you're completely exhausted. You get to the destination, sleep in a tent on the ground, and you wake up the next morning, sore from the previous day, knowing that you have to get back on your bicycle and ride another 75 miles. And the ride on Sunday morning starts, and you look around, and there's not as many people as there were the previous day because a lot of the guys have dropped out. And there's some joking and there's some laughter, but there's not as much as there was the day before. And you ride all day Sunday. Sunday is brutal. And of course, I grew up in Florida, so you always have the heat and humidity to contend with, and that doesn't help. And you'd ride, and it was painful and grueling and more grueling. And then by the end of Sunday, when you're getting close to the end, you would be so spent that it was hard to keep going. You didn't have to. They had trucks riding by. You could put your bike on the truck. They let you ride in the truck and not say anything. That's all right. It's a temptation, but you keep going. You don't go that route. And then finally you cross the finish line. Maybe there's some friends and family waiting for you at the finish line. And you drink some Gatorade with the other riders, and the matter is finished. And let me tell you, there was much more rejoicing at the beginning of the matter than the end. But the end of the matter was so much better than the beginning. There was pain, there was suffering, there was hardship, but there was perseverance, and there was accomplishment too. A lot of money got raised for charity. All of us became a little stronger, and not one of us would have traded being at the end of that ride to go back to the very beginning. Solomon says, this is how life is. And because of this, we especially need to pay attention to verse 10. Again, I'll read that for a third time or whatever. Do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. It's very, very easy to be deep into that long ride and struggling with the grueling nature of it all and sort of a dream of a time before when you didn't have those kinds of struggles. Solomon says, such thinking is foolish. Very easy for us to look back at the good old days and say, I was born in the wrong time. I should have been a cowboy back when times were simple. Or I wish I could have been this age in the 1950s when this country made sense to me. And Solomon says, it is a fool who indulges in these flights of fantasy. Thinking like that. That's us wanting what's easy and feels good and wishing that God would stop Romans 8:28 us so much. My friends, this should not be. Verses 11 and 12. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing. It benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter. But the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. So verse 11, he starts out, I'm reading from the NIV, he says, wisdom like an inheritance is a good thing. Okay, that's true. That's absolutely true and correct. But probably a better translation is the New American Standard here, which I believe says, wisdom along with an inheritance is a good thing. So it seems here, when you dive into the Hebrew, it seems that Solomon wasn't comparing wisdom to prosperity, but instead he's saying that prosperity accompanied by wisdom is a very, very good thing. And that makes sense kind of in the bigger picture of everything Solomon has been talking about here. Talks about an inheritance. Inheritance is something that all of us would appreciate. Right? The idea of having this proverbial rich uncle that you never even heard of, and then one day you get a letter in the mail saying, oh, your uncle so-and-so that you never knew existed was a very wealthy man and had no other heirs. He's passed on to his reward and left his estate to you. Right? This scenario is deeply embedded in our culture because all of us would kind of enjoy something like that happening. But what Solomon is pointing out here is that if something like that were to happen, getting a huge amount of money like that, without wisdom, you could get yourself into trouble pretty quickly, couldn't you? This brings us back to our lottery winner idea. Like, it boggles the mind. How can you win, 50, 60, $100 million and then go bankrupt? Well, pretty simple. You start out without having 50, 60, or $100 million. All of a sudden you have it, and you didn't go through the process to earn it. You didn't earn the wisdom that comes along with working so hard for it. You didn't struggle day in and day out and stress over the particulars of starting a business or working through this thing or through that thing. And those times of suffering, those times of trials, this is God working in our lives, providing those trials to give us the wisdom so we can live the way we're supposed to live. You win the lottery, you skip over the suffering part, you get the inheritance, but you don't have the wisdom to handle that. Without wisdom, you could get yourself into trouble pretty quick. But with wisdom, you can be wise. With the money, you can be wise and you can do good things with it, and that would benefit you. Because of verse 12, wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter. That's very simple. Money is a shelter. You can literally buy a home with it. Money can cover the cost of emergencies. And Solomon is saying wisdom is like this too. Wisdom can protect you when you need protecting. And he says that it literally preserves those who have it. And like everything else that Solomon has been saying, he's not giving us this wisdom in a vacuum. All this stuff that he's saying, it's not just individual pieces of wisdom that are unconnected. All these things string together. He's saying having money is a good thing. Finding pleasure in your life is a good thing. Being in some position of power is a good thing. But Solomon tells us you can have all of these things in abundance and still be a miserable wreck. But with God, it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose to follow God, and we can still have those things. We can still have money and pleasure and power. Maybe God will give us those things. But when we follow God and the rest of the Bible, Solomon and the rest of the Bible tells us that God is going to bring pain into our lives too. And Romans 8:28 included with that. For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. God is doing those things in our lives to equip us with more wisdom, which, along with the inheritance he gives us, is a good thing. And when we let him do that, when we let God give us wisdom this way, then we can truly enjoy the money and the stuff and the power that he gives us while we're waiting to go to heaven. Verses 13 and 14. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. Verse 13, Solomon reminds us that there's just some things out there in life that we can't change no matter how much we want to. Solomon tells us there's just some things in our lives that we just can't change no matter how hard we try. And so we have to recognize then in the face of this, that this too is just part of God's plans, and we have to accept that. And so if what we want to change in our lives happens to be one of these Romans 8:28 moments that God has put in our lives for our good, even though it doesn't feel good, we want to change that, not able to change that. When you are in that situation, don't miss out on the lesson. Don't miss out on the blessing that God's trying to put in your life by banging your head against the wall, trying to change things that you can't. So in verse 14, we get here, and Solomon's already told us, don't run away from the trials of life and just seek pleasure, right? Solomon's been telling us this all along. Don't run away from trials and seek pleasure. God has you in the trials for a reason. Learn from that. But here he's also not saying run away from pleasure and seek trials. You don't need to do that. He's saying that God is going to provide you with plenty of both in your life. So buckle up, enjoy what you can, and try to learn from the rest. Solomon tells us again and again, we don't know exactly what God's plans are for us. 2 weeks ago, he says, you and I are not capable of fathoming God's plans from beginning to end. But one thing that we do know about the future that's certain, one thing that we know is absolutely true and correct, and that is that our lives are not going to turn out the way that we hope they would. The one certainty we know is that our lives will never turn out to be the way we have always imagined that they would go, because, very simply, when you and I lie awake at night thinking about the future and we daydream about what the future holds for us, we tend to leave out a lot of those seasons in our lives, don't we? When we imagine the future, when we fantasize about what could be, almost all of us always imagine a life without chaos and without struggle. We imagine wealth, friends, and good times. God does give us some of that. But in his infinite wisdom, God also blesses us by giving us more. God gives us full lives with every possible season in them. And he grows us and he nurtures us and he uses us through those things precisely the way he intended to all along. We'll go ahead and we'll stop here. Lord willing, next week we'll get together again and we'll continue and finish up chapter 7 of the book of Ecclesiastes. Would you bow with me in prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, again we thank you so very much for letting us be here this morning. Thank you so much for giving us the freedom to be able to assemble and talk about your word openly in our community. We ask that you would please protect those freedoms. And God, we thank you so much for putting Solomon through what you put him through. Thank you so much for having him write down your message, and thank you for perfectly preserving that message that we can learn from this. And God, as we always say, if I have made any mistakes in what I have said up here, I pray you would bring those things to light so people would not be led astray, but we could discard those mistakes. But God, anything that we have talked about that is true and in accordance with your word, God, please give us wisdom from these things. Lord, please write these lessons on our hearts. Help us to be better sons and daughters to you as a result of the things that we have learned. And God, we thank you so much for the trials and the struggles that you put in our lives. For we know that if it was up to us, we wouldn't add those seasons to our lives, and we would never have the opportunity then to grow properly in you and develop wisdom and truly be made better servants, better children for you, that we can serve you better and lead more full lives. Lead us to eternity. God, thank you so much for loving us enough to be our Father, to discipline us and to put us in these hard situations we would otherwise not choose for ourselves. And God, please give us perspective to understand and be inspired by this as we experience these things. God, we also thank you so much for giving us such an abundance that we can enjoy a feast together. Thank you so much for the food that we were about to eat downstairs. Thank you for the hands that have prepared it. We thank you for the opportunity to consume this together and celebrate and proclaim Jesus' death until he returns for us. God, we ask that you would bless this food to our bodies. Help us to glorify you with the energy we receive from it. We love you dearly. God, we also ask your hand of blessing will be upon the board meeting that will follow. Please get us all home safely and bring us back together soon. We love you and pray this in the name of Jesus, your Son. Amen.